The first sign that something was wrong came before the storm even reached them. High above the Pacific, the Wakandan reconnaissance aircraft flew through a band of cloud that should have been empty. Instead, the sky ahead shimmered with unstable light, as if the atmosphere itself had been stitched together from broken glass and static. The instruments flickered. The captain called for a second read. Shuri, seated in the rear, with her console spread across her lap, looked up from the data and frowned. "That island shouldn't be producing that much interference," she said. T'Challa stood near the forward viewport, arms folded, watching the darkness ahead. Yet it is. He had seen enough strange things in his life to know that every anomaly had a cause. Some were natural, some were human. The dangerous ones were often a mix of both. This one carried the weight of old mistakes. The readings Shuri had pulled from Wakandan orbital scans were inconsistent, but the pattern repeated across multiple sweeps: a hidden landmass, an artificial coastline, active heat signatures, electromagnetic pulses, and wildlife densities that made no ecological sense. No official map acknowledged it. No corporate registry admitted it. Yet something had been building, failing, and surviving there for years. Shuri tapped one final key and projected the island's outline in blue light between them. "Satellite shadow says the terrain is large enough to support a full biosphere," she said. "But not stable enough to be natural. Whoever built this place engineered weather dampeners, containment routes, and a power grid big enough to run a small city." T'Challa studied the projection. The geometry of the island made him uneasy, not because of its scale, but because of its intent. The shape of the internal roads, the fences, the enclosed valleys, the transport corridors, all of it spoke of a human mind that believed the world could be partitioned, labeled, and owned. He had seen such thinking before, just with different borders and better marketing. "What else?" he asked. Shuri hesitated, then rotated another layer into view. "Biological profiles," she said. "Large animals, multiple species, some extinct." T'Challa's eyes narrowed. "Extinct how?" She gave him a look that said she wished he had asked the more obvious question first. "Genetically reconstructed," she said. The silence that followed was not disbelief, it was understanding. He had heard the idea before, in the abstract, in the language of ambition dressed as progress. People were always tempted by the past when they could not control the present. They dug up old bones and told themselves science had granted them ownership over what time had taken away. The captain's voice came over the intercom a moment later. 2 minutes to visual. T'Challa moved to the forward glass. Below them, the clouds opened. The island rose out of the sea like a secret that had decided to survive on its own terms. It was lush, green, and ringed with violent surf. White lightning flashed through the upper atmosphere. Farther inland, he could just make out towers, roads, and structures half hidden beneath the canopy. Some were ruined. Some were still lit. The whole place seemed caught between abandonment and occupation. Then the storm hit. The aircraft lurched hard to port. The captain swore under his breath and fought the controls as the storm wall rolled around them with unnatural speed. The instruments screamed. An alarm flashed red across the cockpit. Shuri braced one hand against the wall and reached for the emergency stabilizer. T'Challa was already moving before she spoke. "Not natural," she said. "No," he answered, eyes on the jungle below. The aircraft dropped suddenly, thrown off course by a violent downdraft that had no right existing in such a controlled pattern. Rain hammered the hull. Lightning split the sky in white-blue sheets. The island below disappeared, then reappeared, then vanished again in the smoke and cloud. The captain shouted something about altitude loss. T'Challa grabbed the overhead rail as the entire aircraft bucked sideways, nearly skimming the treetops. On the display, The power systems began failing one by one. The storm was not merely weather, it was interference, a field, a containment failure of some kind, or perhaps the last act of a system that had been built too large to control. Shuri's eyes moved across the diagnostics at speed. "Someone's been masking the island from the outside," she said, half to herself. "But the field is degrading. That's why the storm is forming. The local climate controls are collapsing." "And the animals?" T'Challa asked. She looked up at him, still inside. The aircraft dropped again. The ground came up fast. The captain tried one final correction, but the engine shuddered and died with a sharp metallic crack. The cabin went weightless for a heartbeat, and in that thin, suspended second T'Challa saw everything with impossible clarity: the line of jungle, the broken service roads, a collapsed tower at the island's edge, and the shape of something enormous moving through the trees. He did not have time to name it before impact. The crash tore the world open in a blast of heat, smoke, and screaming metal. When he woke, the first thing T'Challa became aware of was the smell of wet earth. The second was the sound of something heavy moving through the jungle not far away. He opened his eyes slowly, pain flickering across his ribs, and found himself half buried beneath a section of twisted fuselage. The aircraft had split open during the crash, and rain was still drumming through the wreckage in cold, relentless sheets. Sparks sputtered somewhere nearby. One of the emergency lights blinked red above him. He pushed debris aside and sat up. The suit had absorbed most of the impact. His left shoulder ached, and the vibration had left a dull ringing at the base of his skull. But he was alive. Shuri's voice came faintly through the comm, distorted by static. "Brother?" He exhaled in relief. "I am here." "Good," she said, and even through the interference, he could hear the irritation underneath the relief. Quote, "I would be very annoyed if you left me alone with this mess." Unquote. A crash answered from somewhere in the jungle. Not machinery, not debris, something moving with weight and purpose. Shuri's tone sharpened. "That was not human." "No," T'Challa said. He activated the Panther suit's internal diagnostics. Damage was limited, but the external systems were still recovering. A quick pulse lit the edges of his mask display. Environmental readings came online in fragments: high humidity, unstable power signatures, trace electrical fencing, multiple heat blooms at various distances, and one enormous, moving object to the north. He climbed free of the wreckage and surveyed the clearing. The aircraft had come down in a basin of thick jungle, hemmed in by broken stone paths and overgrown service roads. The remains of an old transport station stood on one side, its metal supports rusting under vines. On the other, a collapsed observation tower leaned at an angle against a wall of trees. Everything here had been built by hands that expected control. Now the island had reclaimed it. Shuri was already crawling out of the rear section, holding a compact field scanner in one hand and a toolkit in the other. One of the Dora Milaje emerged behind her, then another, both visibly shaken, but disciplined enough to keep moving. The pilot was alive too, though dazed and badly bruised. T'Challa helped Shuri steady herself. "Can you get a signal out?" he asked. She looked at the sky, then at the wreck, then at the scanner in her hand. Eventually, "That is not a comforting answer." "I know." A low tremor rolled through the ground. All of them froze. The jungle ahead went still in the way wild things do when a larger predator approaches. Rain hissed against broad leaves. Something farther off let out a long, deep call that vibrated through the trees and into their bones. The sound was old, massive, alive. One of the Dora Milaje tightened her grip on her spear-like blade. "What is that?" T'Challa did not answer immediately. His eyes had locked on the far tree line, where the vegetation moved in broad, displacing waves. Then it emerged. A Tyrannosaurus rex stepped out of the jungle like a myth given flesh. It was larger than any beast T'Challa had seen outside Wakanda's protected archives, and those had been extinct for tens of millions of years. Its skin was wet with rain. Its eyes were dark and intelligent in the animal way that meant hunger and instinct rather than thought. It tilted its head, nostrils flaring as it tested the air. No one spoke. The creature's gaze moved from the wreckage to the people, lingering on them in the way all apex predators assess new movement in their territory. T'Challa could feel the tension in the clearing shift around it. The air was charged with it, a living wall of muscle and teeth, and yet there was something almost tragic in the sight. This creature should not have been here. Its existence was a statement made by someone who believed the impossible could be owned if only enough money was spent. The Rex took one step forward. T'Challa stepped between it and the wounded crew. The animal stopped. For a brief, impossible moment, the clearing held a silence so absolute it felt ceremonial. Rain fell. Leaves trembled. The dinosaur's breath rose in white gusts from its nostrils. Then it let out a heavy huff, swung its head toward the wreckage, and turned away, moving back into the trees with a slow, territorial grace. No attack, no chase, just a warning. Shuri blinked after it. Was that a mercy display? Perhaps, T'Challa said. Or perhaps it found us uninteresting. She looked at him. That is somehow worse. He did not disagree. He turned toward the jungle, toward the broken paths and abandoned structures and all the hidden machinery of the island. The storm still muttered in the distance, and somewhere deep inside the canopy, something else had begun to move. He could not yet name the true nature of the place, but he could already feel the shape of it. This was not simply a survival situation. It was an inheritance of human arrogance. Gather what we can carry, he said. We move before darkness. Shuri wiped rain from her face and stared at him. And where exactly are we moving to? T'Challa looked into the green wall of the island. Toward the truth, he said. That was the beginning, not of a rescue, not of a hunt, but of a confrontation between a king and a world that believed life could be reduced to profit, spectacle, and control. The jungle answered them with thunder, and somewhere beyond the trees, something much larger than a Rex was already coming closer. They moved at first light, if the stormy gray sky could still be called light. The crash site was already becoming a trap. Smoke rose in thin black columns from the wreckage, and the sound of distant movement had grown more frequent during the night. T'Challa had made the decision quickly. Stay too long, and they would be pinned between the jungle and whatever still controlled the island. So they gathered the few useful supplies they could salvage, sealed the most seriously injured with emergency dressings, and started uphill along what remained of an old service path. The path itself told a story. Concrete slabs, once bright and clean, were now split by roots thick as serpents. Warning signs still clung to broken posts, most of them faded beyond usefulness. Camera mounts leaned from rusted brackets. Electric fence stanchions stood in a line, their wiring long dead in places and violently alive in others, releasing a crackle every time the storm humidity touched them. The whole environment felt like the aftermath of a grand attempt at control that had been abandoned by the people who once believed they were in charge. Shuri stopped at the remains of a security booth and crouched beside a cracked terminal half buried in mud. Interesting, she murmured. T'Challa waited while she connected a cable from her wrist unit. The display lit up with a flicker of old park maps and environmental controls. Even half dead, the system still recognized the island's internal structure. The image zoomed outward, revealing sector divisions, animal ranges, transport routes, guest zones, veterinary enclosures, and a web of backup power lines buried beneath the terrain. Tell me that's not what I think it is, one of the Dora Milaje said. Shuri's expression hardened. It is exactly what you think it is. T'Challa looked at the map. The island had been divided with a cold, clinical logic. Habitat sectors were separated by species and feeding needs. Human access routes ran through the center. Emergency exits led only toward the sea. It was all so elegant that for a moment it seemed like a legitimate research installation. Then he saw the deeper architecture. Multiple containment points, reinforced corridors, hidden remote gates, behavioral monitoring nodes, a central command complex, hidden beneath the older visitor structures. This was not a conservation facility. It was a designed enclosure. A park, Shuri said, disgust rising in her voice, built to stage extinction as entertainment. One of the crew members, still pale from the crash, stared at the map as if he expected it to change into something more reasonable. "You're saying there are dinosaurs out there?" Shuri looked at him. "I'm saying," she replied, "that's the least strange thing on this island." T'Challa examined the layout for a long moment. "Who built it?" "Human beings," Shuri said. "The worst kind." He was about to respond when the ground shuddered again. Not from the storm this time. From movement, a pack of smaller heat signatures crossed the lower valley in a coordinated pattern, circling rather than rushing. The scanners identified them before the crew saw them, and when they did, the realization spread like cold water. Velociraptors. T'Challa had seen drawings, simulations, museum restorations. None of those had prepared him for the living things moving through the trees with such precision. They were lean, fast, and unnervingly focused, their heads darting as they tested the terrain and each other. Their intelligence was not human, but it was tactical enough to make the word animal feel inadequate. The pack stopped beyond the path. One lowered its head. Another moved to the flank. They were not attacking immediately. They were learning. T'Challa's posture shifted. The crew around him tensed, but he signaled them to remain still. The animal at the center of the pack had lifted its snout, tasting the air. Then, with a flash of motion, the nearest raptor burst from the brush. The attack was so fast that for a split second it seemed like the jungle itself had lunged. T'Challa met it head on. The panther suit absorbed the impact as claws scraped across the vibranium surface with a sound like metal being dragged across stone. He twisted, seized the creature by the neck, and redirected its momentum into a tree trunk hard enough to stun but not kill. The second raptor came from the opposite side. He pivoted, ducked, and drove an elbow into its ribcage. The third was already in the air. Shuri fired a pulse emitter from the terminal booth, the sonic burst shattering the underbrush and throwing the raptors off balance. "Glad I remembered to bring toys," she said. The pack recoiled, but did not flee. They backed into the foliage with hostile intelligence, one by one disappearing into the green as if they had never existed. A final screech echoed from the canopy. Then silence. The crew stared at T'Challa as though he had stepped out of a legend. He glanced at the torn claw marks on his suit and then at the trees. "They are testing boundaries," he said. Shuri nodded, still scanning the path. "And so far, they are learning that we are expensive." That earned the briefest hint of a smile from one of the injured technicians, though it vanished quickly. Nobody was relaxed, nor should they have been. The island had shifted from strange to dangerous with brutal speed, and the danger was not random. It was layered, intentional, and human-made. They followed the path uphill toward the old visitor structures, moving between broken signs and half-hidden surveillance cameras. The deeper they went, the more evidence they found of the island's former function. Gift shops, overgrown with vines, transport stations collapsed under roots. A once grand promenade, now cracked and consumed by the forest. It should have looked like a disaster zone. Instead, it looked like a kingdom that had outgrown its caretakers. At the edge of the central district, they found the first survivors. The group emerged from the trees cautiously, weapons raised but not aimed. They were a mixed collection of staff, scientists, and security personnel, all of them exhausted, dirty, and living on the thin edge between panic and discipline. At their front stood a woman in a rain-spattered jacket with a controlled posture and the expression of someone who had made 3 impossible decisions before breakfast. Claire Deering. She took one look at T'Challa's suit, then at the Wakandan team, then at the wreckage and the blood on everyone's sleeves. "You're not with them," she said. T'Challa removed his mask. "No," he answered. "We are not." Claire studied him for a heartbeat that stretched too long to be comfortable. "Then who are you?" He gave her the answer that was true and incomplete enough to be safe. "I am T'Challa of Wakanda." That did not help her much, but it did make her pause. Shuri, never one to let a moment sit still, stepped forward and added, "And before you ask, no, we are not on the guest list." One of the security men looked between them and muttered, "I'm beginning to think the guest list isn't the issue." Claire didn't smile, but the corners of her mouth softened. "You came by aircraft. The storm knocked you down too?" T'Challa nodded. "It appears the island does not welcome visitors lightly. That's one way to put it." She glanced over his shoulder at the raptor-clawed suit marks and the wounded crew behind him. "You ran into the pack." "Yes, you're still standing. For now." Her eyes flicked toward the jungle where the pack had vanished. Whatever else Claire was, she was practical. She understood danger when it stood in front of her. More importantly, she understood that danger on this island was not a single event, but a system. She motioned them toward a reinforced structure half hidden behind collapsed landscaping walls. "Then come inside. We have shelter, water, and 2 working generators if the line doesn't fail again tonight." T'Challa followed, but not before scanning the surrounding district. The shapes in the trees were moving more than they should. The island was not empty between attacks. It was watching. Inside the shelter, the survivors had made a rough command post from hotel furniture, ration crates, and portable lamps. Maps were spread on every flat surface. Radios hissed with intermittent static. One wall had been covered in handwritten notes, inventory lists, and a growing tally of missing personnel. Everyone looked tired enough to collapse standing. Claire introduced herself properly once they were under cover. "I'm in charge of operations," she said. T'Challa gave a slight nod. "It seems your operations have become survival." Her expression tightened. "Yes, that's new." Shuri leaned against a table and began examining the room's power routing without waiting for permission. "No, it isn't. It only became visible." Claire watched her. "You talk like that a lot?" "Only when I'm right." A tired laugh moved around the room, brief but genuine. It did not last, but it broke the tension enough for people to breathe. Claire gave the island report with the clipped efficiency of someone who had long since passed the point of emotional processing. The park's central systems had failed. Containment had broken across multiple sectors. Several species were now roaming free. Some guests had evacuated before the worst of it. Others had been lost. Corporate response teams had vanished or gone dark. Communication with the mainland was intermittent at best. Shuri asked the practical question first. What kind of system failure? Claire looked at her for a moment, then answered carefully. The kind where the island was never supposed to be this big, this dense, or this aggressive. T'Challa caught the phrasing immediately. Never supposed to be? She hesitated, then said, "This was a private facility, a company-built research park. The official story is tourism and education. The reality is much more ambitious than that." Shuri's eyes sharpened. "Genetic reconstruction?" Claire did not answer, which was answer enough. T'Challa looked at the wall of maps. Then the island was always vulnerable. "Yes," Claire said, and for the first time her voice carried something like anger. "We had containment, emergency response, animal handling, climate controls, independent power, backup feeds, hidden routes, and one very expensive illusion of control. It still wasn't enough." "Because control was the illusion," T'Challa said. That drew her gaze. He continued, calm and unblinking. If life is treated as a product, then eventually the system will fail the product and the people who bought the lie. The question is not whether the island broke. The question is how many people believed it could never happen. Claire looked away first. That was not guilt, exactly. It was recognition. Thunder rolled in the distance. The storm was still moving across the island, but now they could hear other sounds beneath it. Distant calls, heavy footsteps, the scraping of something enormous against metal. The island was becoming louder by the minute. A technician called from the radio desk. "We're picking up movement near the central visitor promenade. Could be more survivors." Claire was already reaching for a map when the radio cracked again with a burst of static and a voice that sounded panicked and far away. A partial message cut through the noise. "Security breach creature in the pen." Repeat. Creature in the pen. Then silence. Everyone in the room looked at one another. T'Challa stepped to the map table and studied the marked sectors. The message had come from near the old display region. If there were survivors there, they were also near the largest concentration of open enclosures. That meant predators. Multiple. He looked up at Claire. "We go." She did not hesitate. "We?" He met her eyes. "You know the island. We know how to survive difficult terrain and worse odds. It is enough." End quote. Claire gathered her people quickly. 2 of the security staff volunteered. 1 biologist insisted on coming despite a sprained ankle. Shuri armed herself with a compact energy emitter and a field jammer she had assembled from the shelter's broken equipment. The Dora Milaje took point with quiet discipline. As they stepped back into the rain, T'Challa felt the island's strange pulse around them. Not literally, though the ground seemed alive with it. More than that, the place had a rhythm. A living tension. A conflict between what had been built and what had escaped. They moved toward the central district together, through broken paths and flooded courtyards, past signposts advertising wonders that had become warnings. The deeper they went, the more the park revealed itself in pieces. Giant containment gates, shattered observation pens, half-submerged service vehicles, and the impossible truth moving through the foliage around them. This was not a park anymore. It was a failed kingdom of human ambition. And somewhere at the center of it all, something larger than a Rex was still coming. The message had led them into the heart of the park. By the time they reached the central promenade, rain had eased into a thin mist, and the island's broken architecture stood around them like the ruins of a very expensive mistake. Glass panels were shattered. Decorative lights hung dead from bent poles. A half-collapsed fountain overflowed with rainwater and silt. Between the cracked pathways, vines had pushed up through the stone and spread across the old visitor district as if nature were reclaiming a stolen throne. The survivors moved carefully. T'Challa kept one eye on the tree line and one on the group. Claire was ahead now, leading with the fast, purposeful stride of someone who had spent too many hours making decisions under pressure. 2 security staff flanked the rear. The injured technician was being helped along by one of the Dora Milaje. Shuri stayed slightly behind T'Challa, scanning the district with a compact diagnostic device that kept flickering every time the wind shifted. The central district should have felt abandoned. Instead, it felt watched. Then they heard the scream. It came from somewhere beyond the old retail arcade. A sharp burst of panic cut off too quickly. Claire immediately changed direction, moving toward the sound without waiting for a discussion. T'Challa matched her pace. "You have a habit of running toward danger." Claire didn't look at him. "It's usually where the people are. That is a very poor habit. Today, it's the only one I have." They rounded the broken corner of a souvenir building and found the first body lying in the open path, not dead, trembling. A maintenance worker, face gray with shock, one arm pinned beneath a fallen metal railing. His eyes were fixed on the trees behind T'Challa. He was trying to speak. At first, no one understood him. Then, the meaning came in fragments. out of the enclosure came through the didn't see it. The growl behind them was low, guttural, and close enough to vibrate in the chest. Everyone turned. The creature standing in the path was not one of the raptors they had encountered earlier. This one was bulkier, lower to the ground, heavily scarred, and moving with a strange stillness that made it seem more dangerous than the noise around it. Its head tilted slightly as it studied the people in front of it. Not curiosity, assessment. A predatory intelligence with too many survival instincts and not enough fear. Shuri whispered, "That is absolutely not a normal dinosaur." T'Challa did not answer. His attention was fixed on the animal's eyes, on the positioning of its body, on the tension in its muscles. The creature was not merely approaching, it was deciding. Claire backed a step toward the injured worker. The animal reacted instantly, not to her movement alone, but to the shift in the group's energy. It lunged forward with explosive speed. T'Challa moved at the same moment, intercepting it before it reached the exposed man. The impact knocked him backward a half step, claws scraping against vibranium with a harsh, metallic hiss. The creature was stronger than it looked. It slammed its weight into him again. T'Challa twisted to absorb the force, then hooked an arm around its neck and redirected its momentum into the fountain wall. Stone cracked. Water exploded into the air. The beast recoiled, shaking itself free, and snapped its jaws inches from his shoulder. Claire shouted for the others to pull the worker clear. Shuri raised her emitter, but T'Challa signaled her not to fire yet. He wanted to study it. More importantly, he needed to know whether it was acting alone or being driven by something larger. The answer came when the trees behind them rustled. More movement. 3 raptors emerged from the undergrowth on the left, another on the right. All of them circling, all of them keeping their distance from the larger beast in the center. Claire saw it immediately. "It's hurting us." Or, T'Challa said, "We are in its territory, and this is the language it uses." The big creature turned its head slightly. One of the raptors gave a sharp clicking sound, and the whole group shifted with unsettling coordination. They were not just hunting, they were working together. Shuri's voice had gone tight. "That is a new level of bad." The maintenance worker, half conscious, groaned as one of the security men hauled him back. T'Challa stepped forward, giving the central animal exactly the kind of resistance it expected. It responded with a violent charge. He dodged left, let it overshoot, then struck low against the shoulder joint. The beast stumbled. One of the raptors broke from the ring, trying to exploit the opening, but the Dora Milaje met it with a quick, brutal strike that sent it tumbling back into the brush. The larger animal recovered faster than it should have. It whirled and lunged again. T'Challa caught its jaws with both forearms and held the pressure just long enough to force it back. The suit absorbed the strain, but he could feel the power behind the creature. It was all muscle and aggression, yes, but also adaptation. This thing had learned how to push humans into panic, and it was testing him in particular. He saw it then in the way the eyes moved, the way the head recalibrated after each strike. Not a beast, not fully. An experiment. A thing shaped by human hands and then turned loose. "Claire," he said, "get the wounded out of the open." She was already moving. "Shuri, working on it." Shuri slammed the emitter against the cracked wall panel of a nearby service kiosk and patched it into the old park defense grid. A second later, a burst of sonic interference ripped through the district. The raptors hesitated. The bigger creature recoiled with an angry bellow, shaking its head as if trying to dislodge the noise from inside its skull. It did not flee, but it gave them the opening they needed. The security staff dragged the maintenance worker behind a concrete planter, but the Dora Milaje formed a defensive line near the arcade entrance. T'Challa pushed the larger creature back with controlled force, then stepped sideways to keep it away from the injured and the exposed. Claire stood near the broken promenade railing, staring at the animal like someone trying to understand a system in the middle of collapse. "What is it?" she asked. T'Challa drove a kick into the beast's flank, forcing it off balance, and answered without taking his eyes off the threat. Something made by people who believed evolution could be improved with arrogance. Shuri looked up from the emitter. "I hate that answer." "Hell, it is the correct one." The pack withdrew again, but not far. They moved back into the shadows of the arcade and the overgrown displays, keeping the group under observation. The larger animal remained near the center path, head low, breathing hard, as if it understood that the encounter was still incomplete. Then, for one strange moment, it did nothing. It simply looked at T'Challa. Not at the suit, at him. The rain was gone now, replaced by a humid stillness that made the silence feel heavy. The creature's gaze held in a way that was almost unnerving, not because it seemed human, but because it seemed to recognize leadership, challenge, presence. T'Challa took a measured breath. The animal lowered its head, and then it stepped back into the foliage. The raptors followed. The clearing remained intact. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Claire exhaled and said, in the flat voice of someone whose life had moved beyond the point of ordinary language, "I'm going to pretend that was a warning." Shuri lowered her device. "It was absolutely a warning. That makes me feel worse." "It should." T'Challa straightened and watched the direction the pack had taken. They are not simply attacking at random. Something in the island's structure is shaping their movement. Claire turned to him. "You think the park management systems are still active?" "Not active," he said. "Interrupted. The difference matters." That answer unsettled her more than the dinosaurs had. They secured the injured worker and moved through the promenade toward a nearby operations hub that Claire said had been used for environmental control. The building had once been a polished, modern structure with panoramic windows overlooking the island. Now one entire side had caved in, and the remaining glass was dark with grime and plant growth. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and dead electronics. Broken monitors lined the walls, some still flickering with residual power. Floor maps of the park glowed faintly under emergency strips. A failed coffee machine sat beside a table covered in handwritten notes, half-finished ration logs, and diagrams of enclosure routes. Someone had been trying to keep the place running long after it should have been impossible. Claire moved directly to the central console. "Maybe we can get the internal maps to come back up," she said. "If the subsystem is still feeding from the reserve grid, we could track movements and find the others." Shuri was already kneeling by the power block. Or the grid could be feeding something else entirely. T'Challa looked at the wall screen as it flickered to life in fragments. There it was again, the island's internal architecture, but much more detailed than the rough maps Shuri had pulled earlier. This was the real operational core: habitat zones, maintenance routes, medical access, remote feeding programs, hidden transport lines, cold storage vaults, private access roads, guest sectors, research, annexes, emergency, lockdown points. And beneath all of it, a central record. He pointed to it. "What is that?" Claire followed his gaze and went still. "I don't know." She moved to the console, typed fast, then stopped. Her face changed. "What?" Shuri asked. Claire did not answer immediately. She was reading something she clearly wished she weren't. "What is it?" T'Challa repeated. She swallowed once. "It's an override log." "From where?" She hesitated. "From a part of the island the board said was offline." Shuri came around the console and looked over her shoulder. Her eyes narrowed, then widened slightly. "This place still has a core command system," she said. "A real one, not just backups." Claire stared at the screen as the log continued to scroll in red text. "That means someone still has access." T'Challa's eyes stayed on the display. "Who?" Claire's voice was suddenly very quiet. "That's what I need to find out." At that same moment, a sound came from outside. Not a roar, not a crash. A distant human scream. Every person in the room froze. Another sound followed, lower, more terrible. Something large moving through the corridor network outside, its weight striking the pavement in slow, deliberate steps. The security man by the door lifted his weapon. "That's not one of the ones from the path." "No," said T'Challa. He was already moving before the others realized why. He looked back at Claire. "Where does that corridor lead?" She checked the map, her face drained. "To the Central Containment District." T'Challa's voice tightened. "Then we are going." Claire took one look at the outside feed on the monitor, where a blurred shape was now crossing the broken courtyard, and said, "We're all going." Shuri shut down the console and grabbed her tools. "Good. I was worried this island was going to make us boring." The group headed toward the corridor, with weapons ready and hearts far less steady than they wanted to admit. The island was no longer just a place of dinosaurs and broken buildings. It was revealing the deeper shape of itself, one hidden system at a time, and T'Challa could feel the truth gathering around them like weather. Somewhere ahead, behind concrete walls and sealed doors, the thing that had led them here was still moving, and whatever had built this place had left behind more than ruins. It had left behind intention. The corridor into the Central Containment District had once been built for guests who wanted to feel brave at a safe distance. Now it felt like a throat. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the humidity replaced by damp concrete and the sour smell of old machinery. Emergency lights flickered in red intervals along the walls, painting the group in brief, uneven flashes. Every step echoed too loudly. Every breath seemed to travel too far. The island had become quieter after the scream, but the silence was the dangerous kind, the kind that meant something large was moving just out of sight. Claire led them through the first checkpoint, with the confidence of someone who knew every hidden route in the place, even the ones she had never wanted to know. "This should not still be powered," she muttered. Shuri glanced at the conduit lines above them. "And yet, here we are." T'Challa said nothing. He was listening. There were sounds ahead, faint but distinct, metal scraping against concrete, water dripping in a slow rhythm, and beneath that, something breathing with the deep, deliberate pace of a large animal that was not yet alarmed. The corridor opened into a broader maintenance hub, lined with glass observation panels. Beyond them stretched a network of old transport tunnels and chained service gates. Several had been torn open from the inside. One of the security staff raised a hand. Movement. Everyone stopped. At the far end of the hub, a figure moved across a broken observation bridge. Not human. Not at first glance. It was too large to be one of the raptors, and too fast to be the heavyweight predator they had encountered earlier. The shape slipped in and out of the light, half hidden by a bank of mist leaking from a ruptured cooling pipe. Then it turned its head, and the form resolved itself into something with an almost obscene wrongness to it. A long-limbed, low-slung creature with scarring across its flank, patches of altered pigmentation, and eyes that never seemed to rest in one place for long. Shuri's voice dropped to a whisper. "That is not a normal specimen." "No," T'Challa said. The thing moved again, too quickly. It lunged from the bridge to the service rail below in one fluid motion and vanished into the darker side of the chamber. Claire swore under her breath. "What is it doing?" T'Challa did not answer immediately. He was studying the tracks in the dust, the way the creature had moved, the angle of the broken gates, the fresh claw marks on the reinforced wall. "It is navigating," he said at last. Shuri looked at him. "Animals do that. This one is doing more than that." The light overhead flickered. A second shape appeared behind the first. Then a third. The security staff tightened their grip on their weapons. One of the Dora Milaje shifted into a lower stance, ready to intercept. Claire's face hardened. She knew what the island was capable of now, and the fact that more than one predator was inside the district meant something had gone badly wrong. Or very intentionally right, depending on who had built the system. The first creature darted into the open, smaller than the earlier beast, faster than it should have been, and unnervingly quiet. A raptor. Not just any raptor, but one of the pack hunters. Its head jerked, and it gave a sharp click. The second and third shapes answered from the side corridor. Then the larger animal emerged behind them. It was the one from the promenade. T'Challa recognized the scarred flank and the hard, assessing stare. The animal moved with the caution of a veteran. It did not rush forward. It watched the corridor, the people, the exits, and the points of weakness. The smaller raptors positioned themselves around it, like attendants around a commander. The realization settled across the group all at once. They were being coordinated. Not instinctively. Not by accident. Something in the district was organizing them. "Claire," T'Challa said, "tell me, this is not how they behave normally." Her face had gone pale. "It isn't." Shuri's eyes narrowed as she studied the pack's movement pattern. "They're not just hunting, they're guarding territory." The larger creature snapped its head toward a side chamber as a loud metallic bang echoed from within. The raptors moved instantly, one toward the noise, one toward the rear exit, one toward the observation bridge. The whole pack shifted with a discipline that did not belong to random animals. Then another scream broke the tension. This one came from the side chamber. A survivor. Claire moved first. "That's one of ours." She was already running before anyone could stop her, and T'Challa followed immediately. Because hesitation in a place like this was a luxury the island would punish. The side chamber was an old intake room cluttered with broken storage racks and collapsed power units. A maintenance technician had been cornered against a wall, one leg trapped beneath a bent beam. He was trying to keep still, but the shape looming over him gave him little room for courage. Above him stood a raptor. T'Challa crossed the room in a blur. The raptor turned at the last second, snapping its jaws, but the panther suit took the blow and carried him through the attack. He drove the creature sideways into a rack of rusted tools. Metal clanged loudly. The technician screamed again. Claire and Shuri rushed in behind him, with one of the security staff hauling the injured man clear. Another raptor vaulted through the broken doorway. The Dora Milaje intercepted it mid-air, shoving it down with a clean, brutal strike that sent it skidding across the floor. The beast scrambled back to its feet, hissing. The chamber was suddenly full of motion, all of it sharp and dangerous, and too fast to comfortably follow. Then the larger creature entered. The room seemed to contract around it. It did not attack immediately. It watched the people evacuating the injured man, then the panther suit, then the exit routes. It was measuring the arrangement of strength, weakness, and distraction. T'Challa could feel its attention on him specifically. It had learned something from their earlier encounter. It knew who the threat was. The animal lunged. T'Challa met it with the full force of a controlled counterstrike, stepping aside and catching the creature's momentum with a precise shoulder turn that redirected it into a support column. The impact cracked old concrete and shook dust from the ceiling. The animal recovered, snarling, and came again with the kind of fury that only makes sense when survival has already become a habit. Shuri fired her emitter. The sonic burst slammed into the chamber and briefly destabilized the smaller raptors. One collapsed, stunned long enough for the security staff to pull back. The larger creature recoiled, shaking its head, but not retreating. "Why isn't it leaving?" Shuri shouted over the noise. T'Challa ducked beneath a sweep of claws and answered while driving a blow into the animal's shoulder, because it has been taught that this chamber matters. How comforting. Not comforting. Important. He looked past the beast to the open maintenance routes, the old power feeds, the hidden transport spine that ran through the district like a buried vein. Claire had noticed it too. Her eyes were on the map fragments displayed on a wall terminal just beyond the chamber door. "T'Challa," she shouted, "I think this whole sector is part of the park's original control core." He struck the creature's flank, forcing it to pivot away from the evac path, and moved closer to her without fully taking his eyes off it. Explain. Claire pointed at the map. The public park was only the surface layer. Beneath it, there's a private systems network. Security access, habitat control, veterinary monitoring, transit overrides everything. If something in this district is still running, it could be directing the movement of the predators. Shuri had already caught up. Or somebody is using the system manually. That possibility changed the room, not because it was more terrifying than the dinosaurs, but because it meant the island was not simply failing, it was being used. The larger creature turned again, nostrils flaring. It was learning too, now that it had identified the shifting balance in the room. T'Challa felt the subtle change in the animal's stance. It no longer seemed like a random predator guarding a nest. It seemed like a sentinel. Then the raptors answered from the corridor behind them. One call, then another. The pack had regrouped. The human survivors were trapped between coordinated predators in a sector full of dead technology and hidden routes. Claire swallowed hard. We need another way out. Shuri's gaze moved across the room. I may have one. She crouched beside a wall panel half hidden beneath a fallen display rack and tore it open with a practiced motion that made one of the security staff blink in alarm. You knew this was here? Claire asked. I know many things, Shuri said. Most of them are useful. Some of them are concerning. Inside the panel was an old manual override junction. Not elegant, but functional. She connected a device from her sleeve, then looked up at T'Challa. If I can reroute the service locks, I can open the south conduit and seal this chamber behind us. And the animals? Claire asked. Shuri hesitated. T'Challa answered before she could. They remain trapped if we simply flee. Claire stared at him, then at the predators, blocking the exits. They'll die if we lock them inside with no air. Not if the system still has functioning vent routes, Shuri said, eyes already scanning the display. There are auxiliary channels, but they are tied to the same power grid as the core logistics. So fix it, T'Challa said. She looked up sharply. That could take time. We have time until we do not. That was all the answer needed. The security staff helped move the wounded into a corner of the chamber. One Dora Milaje took point at the doorway. The other watched the raptors. T'Challa remained near the larger creature, not because he trusted it, but because its attention made the pack's movements easier to anticipate. The beast watched him back with the hard, unreadable stare of a king who had never chosen the title. Claire came to his side while Shuri worked. This is insane, she said quietly. Yes, you say that like it's ordinary. It is ordinary on worlds ruled by arrogance. She gave a tired laugh that came out more like disbelief than amusement. And what world is that? He glanced at her. More than one. That unsettled her in a way he did not intend. But before she could ask anything else, Shuri called out from the console. I found the source. Everyone turned. Shuri pointed to the map. There's an active node in the lower core district. Small, but persistent. It's being fed from a backup channel through an access point marked for executive use only. Claire's eyes widened. That should be sealed. It isn't. Meaning? Meaning, Shuri said. Someone with authority over the island is still inside its systems. T'Challa looked at the display, then at the corridor lines branching toward the lower core district. His mind assembled the pieces quickly. The island's predators were behaving as though they were guarding something. The systems were still active. The central logs had shown an override. And now there was an access channel no ordinary staff should have been able to reach. Someone was still here. Or someone had never left. The larger predator suddenly lifted its head and gave a short, low call. The raptors shifted again. A second later, the wall terminal burst into static, then displayed a fresh alert in red text. Core access breach lower district. The room went still. Claire went white. That's not good. No, T'Challa said, already moving toward the corridor. That is the answer. Shuri pulled the junction panel closed and grabbed her device. I hate it when you say things like that. You will hate it more if we do not move. The pack ahead of them had already begun to disperse toward the lower district, not fleeing, responding. The larger creature was the last to go, its scarred body slipping through the broken door with a final glance back at T'Challa. Not a challenge, a choice. The island had shown them the route, and whatever waited below was now impossible to ignore. Claire drew a breath, steadied herself, and followed the others into the next corridor. The core district was deeper than the park's public map admitted, and something down there had just opened its eyes. The lower core district was not built for visitors, and it showed. The corridors narrowed as they descended, the polished public surfaces giving way to raw maintenance concrete, bundled power lines, and sealed bulkheads stamped with faded warnings. The air grew colder with every level. The humidity lessened. The smell changed from wet vegetation and rot to dust, metal, and old electrical burn. This was the skeleton beneath the island's face, the place where the illusion of order had been built and maintained long after the people responsible stopped believing in it. Claire led them down a spiral stairwell that should have been locked. It wasn't accessible from the public side, she said, almost to herself. Not unless someone knew where to look. T'Challa kept pace beside her. You did not know? No? Then someone else did. She nodded grimly. Behind them, the security staff moved in a tight formation. The wounded worker was now able to walk, though only barely. Shuri remained in front of the group's rear line, scanning the corridor walls with a handheld reader that kept flickering each time the power fluctuated. The Dora Milaje watched the corners with absolute calm, which T'Challa found reassuring in a situation that deserved no reassurance at all. At the bottom of the stairwell, the corridor opened into an old service node lined with heavy cables and redundant consoles. Most of the screens were dead. Some still pulsed with low backup power. On the far wall, a transparent maintenance panel showed the route of the island's hidden systems, transport tunnels, executive access lines, environmental control feeds, emergency containment channels, and one central node marked with a designation Claire recognized immediately. She stopped. That's impossible. Shuri came up beside her. What is? Claire pointed at the designation. That section was shut down before the park even opened. T'Challa read the code, then looked at the layout of the surrounding grid. The node was not just active, it was recently accessed. This island has a memory, he said. Shuri gave him a look. That is one way to describe corporate negligence. He did not answer. He was watching the tunnel beyond the node. Something had moved in the darkness ahead. Not fast, not random. The motion was controlled, almost careful. A sound followed, metallic and irregular, like a hinged hatch being opened and closed again by a hand not entirely sure of its own strength. Claire lowered her voice. Tell me you heard that. I heard it, T'Challa said. A pause. Then from deeper in the district, another sound, a low, drawn-out click, the kind of noise made by machinery trying to wake up or by something intelligent testing the shape of a room. Shuri checked the reader and frowned. Thermal signatures ahead. One large, two smaller. Wait. She leaned closer. No, that one's not animal. Claire turned sharply. What do you mean, not animal? I mean, Shuri said slowly, there's human heat in there. That changed the air in the corridor. The team moved forward more cautiously now, taking the next bend into a broader chamber whose ceiling was lost in darkness. Emergency lights flickered along the floor at irregular intervals, creating bands of red and shadow across the concrete. The chamber was half storage, half control center. Crates were stacked against one wall, most of them sealed in gray polymer housing. Old observation monitors lined the opposite side. Some cracked, some still live. A central workstation sat beneath a suspended data arm, and beside it stood a reinforced containment door with the kind of lock that suggested whatever was behind it had once required serious caution. Claire froze when she saw the crates. These were never on the public inventory. she murmured. T'Challa scanned the markings. What are they? She looked ill. Genetic samples, archived specimens, backup material from the research program. End. R. Shuri's expression sharpened instantly. Backup? For what? Claire did not answer right away. That hesitation was answer enough. For recovery, she said at last. The word landed heavily. Not just preserved records, not just storage. A hidden archive, built not as a museum, but as a failsafe. T'Challa understood immediately why the island's hidden systems were still active. Someone had wanted to make sure the work could continue no matter what happened to the surface park. He stepped toward the workstation. The screen flickered on as he approached, as if responding to motion. A file directory appeared, then another. The archive was old, but not dead. The file names were not about tourism. They were about organisms, viability, containment, hybridization, feeding response, and behavioral conditioning. Shuri came to his side and read the display with growing disgust. These people were doing far more than reconstruction, she said. They were editing, merging, stabilizing, testing. This wasn't just cloning. Claire braced one hand on the workstation to steady herself. It was supposed to be conservation. T'Challa looked at her. No, conservation preserves what exists. This was control, disguised as preservation. She flinched because she knew he was right. The sound came again from beyond the containment door. This time it was unmistakably human. A voice. Weak, crooked, but human. Help. Everyone turned toward the door. Claire took one step forward, then stopped, uncertainty and fear colliding on her face. That shouldn't be possible. Shuri's eyes were on the lock. Someone is inside. T'Challa moved immediately to the control panel. Then we open it. Claire hesitated. We don't know what's in there. We know someone is alive. That is not the same thing. No, he said. It is better. She did not argue after that. The panel was partly damaged, but the lock still had power. Shuri bypassed the first security layer, while one of the security staff covered the chamber entrance. The Dora Milaje shifted into position. T'Challa placed a hand on the door seam and felt the faint vibration of something on the other side. Alive. Not necessarily safe, but alive. The hatch released with a heavy pneumatic hiss. Cold air flowed out from the chamber beyond. Then a figure stumbled into the doorway. It was a man, white-haired, thin, almost frail-looking, with a torn shirt and blood on one sleeve. He braced himself against the frame, as though his legs had forgotten how to carry him. His face was lined with exhaustion and strain, and in the half-light, he looked like someone who had spent too long surviving the consequences of his own decisions. Claire stared at him in disbelief. No, she said. The man looked up, eyes widening when he saw her. Claire. She took a step back, not from fear exactly, but from shock. You're supposed to be on the mainland. He gave a weak, bitter smile. That was the plan. T'Challa looked between them. The recognition was immediate and complicated. This was not an ordinary survivor. Claire knew him. The room knew it too, though nobody yet understood the weight of that fact. Shuri studied the man's face. Who is he? Claire answered without taking her eyes off him. Dr. Henry Wu. The name meant something to the room in the same way a locked blade means something to a hand that finds it unexpectedly. He was not armed, not threatening in an obvious way, but every part of his posture suggested a man who understood systems, secrecy, and the gap between what is built and what is admitted. T'Challa asked the question directly. What is he doing here? Claire's mouth tightened. He's the lead geneticist. That was enough to tell the shape of the truth, even before she added the rest. He helped design the island's animals. The chamber seemed to cool another degree. Wu swallowed, visibly unsteady, and looked from one face to the next as if measuring whether he had any chance of controlling the room. I was trapped, he said. Shuri gave him a flat stare. That is a very selective use of the past tense. He ignored her and focused on Claire. I tried to stop this. Claire barked a short, incredulous laugh. You helped build it. I know. You made something you couldn't control. Yes? The honesty of the answer made the room go still. Wu lowered his gaze. And now, the island is breaking apart because no one listened when I said the containment model was unsustainable. That made Claire's expression harden into anger. You did not say that because you were against it. You said that because you wanted a better version. He looked at her for a beat too long. That may also be true. T'Challa stepped forward enough to place himself between Wu and the rest of the group. Not threatening, simply present. What is in the chamber? Wu hesitated. Then, quietly, a backup specimen. Shuri frowned. Specimen of what? He looked away. One of the early hybrid projects. Claire's face changed. T'Challa saw it immediately. Not surprise, but dread. She knew the answer before he said it. An animal made from more than one line, Wu continued. The model was meant to prove that a controlled predator could be stabilized, tracked, and used to maintain ecological balance. Shuri's voice sharpened. Used by whom? Wu did not answer. That answer arrived from the chamber itself. A sound of metal shifting, then a low hiss. A dark shape moved behind the doorway beyond Wu, where the containment chamber had not fully opened. One of the security staff raised his weapon immediately. There's something else in there. T'Challa's eyes stayed fixed on the opening. The shape stepped forward. Not fully visible at first, only a shoulder, a neck, the line of a head. Then the creature emerged. It was smaller than the scarred hunter from the promenade, but no less unsettling. Its body showed a strange mix of traits. One line in its limbs, another in its skin pattern, another in the shape of its head and teeth. It had the physical confidence of a predator and the unnerving stillness of something that had never had a chance to grow wild. Its eyes moved slowly across the room. Not feral, not calm, assessing. T'Challa understood at once why the chamber had been sealed. This was not a wild dinosaur in the ordinary sense. This was a design. Claire's voice came out strained. That should not exist. Wu looked at the creature, then at her. It does. Why? For the same reason everything else here does. Shuri's jaw tightened. Because someone thought they could improve life. Wu's expression suggested guilt had become a permanent resident. That was the theory, he said. The creature moved one step into the chamber. No one fired. The air had changed. There was danger in the room, but also something stranger. The quiet horror of seeing an engineered living thing look back at the people who made it, and not knowing whether it understood enough to hate them. T'Challa studied the animal carefully. The gait was wrong for a fully natural organism, too precise, too deliberate. Its breathing was shallow, controlled by training or by instinct born in a laboratory. This was a creature made to be what a human designer had wanted, and then denied the right to become anything else. The realization settled across him like a weight. Not all the island's monsters were made by accident. Some were deliberate. Claire seemed to come to the same conclusion at the same time. She looked at Wu with open, furious disbelief. How many? Wu said nothing. How many hybrids did you make? He closed his eyes for a brief second. Enough. The word was worse than a confession. The creature in the chamber made a sound low, not quite a growl, not quite a call. The larger, scarred predator from the corridor answered from somewhere deeper in the district. The raptors responded too, faintly, like a network of living alarms. Shuri moved closer to the console, reading the file directory before anyone could stop her. Her face went still. T'Challa, she said, voice carefully controlled. The archive here contains more than specimen records. It has operational logs. He looked at her. Meaning? Meaning someone has been monitoring the island's predators in real time. Claire turned toward her. That's impossible. Shuri pointed to the screen. Not impossible. Expensive. The screen scrolled again. A single line of text appeared on the directory. Executive access. Active. Claire stared at the words as if they had insulted her personally. That account should have been deactivated. Wu's face changed. Just slightly. Enough for T'Challa to notice. Shuri noticed too. "You know something." He looked up, carefully avoiding the screen. That was answer enough. T'Challa's voice went quiet. "Where is the access coming from?" Wu did not answer immediately. Then, at last, "It isn't coming from the mainland." The chamber fell still. Claire's face drained of color. Shuri looked between them, understanding the direction of the answer before it was fully spoken. "Then, who is still here?" Wu swallowed hard. "Someone who should not be." And in the sealed chamber behind him, the hybrid shifted, lowered its head, and listened as though it had heard the true question before any of them asked it. For a moment, nobody moved. The chamber seemed to hold its breath around them, as if the island itself was waiting to see what they would do with the truth. "Doctor." Wu stood in the doorway of the containment room like a man who had spent too long standing behind locked doors and was only now realizing the locks had never really been for everyone else. Claire stared at him with a kind of anger that came only from betrayal mixed with history. Shuri's eyes were fixed on the active executive access line on the screen. T'Challa remained still, but every sense in him had sharpened. Something was managing this island. Something with authority. Something still inside the system. "Explain," Claire said. Wu looked exhausted enough to collapse, but he stayed upright. There was a contingency. Claire let out a cold laugh. Of course there was. "No," he said, sharper than before. "You don't understand. The park was never meant to be fully dependent on the surface staff. There was a hidden oversight structure. Executive command. Internal monitoring. If containment failed, the system could be stabilized remotely." Shuri's expression darkened. "Could be?" Wu looked at the screen. "Should have been." T'Challa's gaze did not leave him. "But it is not." Wu shook his head once. "Not cleanly. The access pathway was compromised." Claire took a step toward him. "By who?" For the first time, Wu looked genuinely afraid. "I don't know," he said. Then, after a pause that told the room he was choosing his words carefully, "I know only that someone inside the old corporate chain still has credentials. Maybe stolen, maybe inherited, maybe never turned off." Shuri frowned. "That does not happen by accident." "No," T'Challa said. "It does not." The hybrid in the containment chamber shifted behind Wu, its claws making a faint scraping sound against the floor. It had not attacked. It had not fled. It remained there, like a witness, shaped into flesh, listening to every word. Claire crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "And you never thought to mention this before the island started falling apart?" Wu gave her a look that was almost wounded. "I did not know the breach had happened until too late. That's not what I asked." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." The silence that followed was more damaging than any argument. Claire had known Wu once as a professional, maybe even as a colleague she could bargain with. Now, every word out of him sounded like one more layer on a structure built to hide the truth beneath convenience. T'Challa could see that the island systems, like many human institutions, had been designed not simply to manage power, but to distribute blame when power failed. He moved to the workstation and studied the access logs again. The active signal was pulsing through a concealed channel. The pattern was complex enough to resist casual intrusion, but not sophisticated enough to be untraceable. Someone had routed into the island's core through a narrow executive line and was using a manual override node to retain limited control over environmental and containment functions. He looked at Shuri. "Can you isolate the source?" Her mouth tilted slightly, not in humor, but in focus. "I can try. But if they are using legacy corporate routing, they probably buried redundancy under 3 layers of bad architecture." That sounds unpleasant. It is. They built this place like a monument to poor decisions. Claire turned away from Wu and looked at the screen with growing dread. If someone is still accessing the core, then they can see everything. Yes, Shuri said. They can move animals. Yes. They can open and close sectors. Yes. Then they can trap people. Shuri's answer was softer this time. Yes. That word made the room colder. T'Challa glanced at the hybrid again. Its head had tilted slightly, as if responding not to their fear, but to their intention. The creature had not been born wild. It had been formed in a place where control was the highest aspiration and empathy the first thing cut away. Now it stood in the middle of a broken containment room, while the people who had built the world around it tried to decide whether the thing controlling the island was a human being or something that had learned to wear one. Claire noticed the creature too. Her face tightened. What happens if we shut down the core feed? Wu answered before Shuri could. The district lockdowns will fail, and if we don't? The island remains partially under control, he said, at least enough to prevent total collapse. T'Challa considered the options. Every choice on this island came wrapped in damage. Restore control, and you risk preserving the machinery of exploitation. Remove control, and you may unleash every damaged system at once. It was the sort of dilemma that revealed not how powerful a person was, but what they believed leadership was for. He asked the question that mattered most. Can the predators be guided away from the human routes? Wu hesitated. Yes, the habitat network can still reroute movement if it is fed correctly. Shuri looked up. Then why hasn't it? Wu met her gaze and then looked away. Because someone is using the same network to drive them toward specific sectors. The answer landed like a blade. Claire's voice went thin. Toward what sectors? Wu did not answer immediately, and that delay told T'Challa enough. Toward people, T'Challa said. Wu said nothing. There was a kind of silence that meant guilt had finally found the point where denial ended. Claire stared at him in disbelief, then in anger, and finally in something closer to hurt. Are you telling me, she said slowly, that somebody is using the animals as a weapon? Wu closed his eyes. Yes. The word hit the room with brutal force. Shuri straightened from the console. That is not a malfunction. That is a deliberate act. T'Challa's jaw set. Who? Wu looked between them and seemed, for a moment, less like a scientist and more like a man who understood that whatever answer he gave would define the rest of his life. I don't know the name behind the login, he said, but I know the pattern. Claire stepped closer. Then tell us the pattern. Wu swallowed. They are forcing movement in the larger predators, pushing them away from the southern enclosures and into the evacuation corridors. The goal is not to kill them, it is to create panic, to isolate people, to make the island look beyond saving. Shuri's eyes sharpened. Why? Wu's answer was quiet, and it was the worst possible answer. So the assets can be recovered. Nobody spoke. The meaning was instant. If the island collapsed into enough chaos, someone on the mainland or offshore could justify a private recovery action. Transport, sample retrieval, control transfer. Forced containment by external contractors. The chaos would become the excuse. The beasts, the archive, the hidden lab, the genetic data, all of it would be declared salvage. Claire's hands clenched. They're trying to steal the island. Not the island, Wu said. The value in it. T'Challa looked at the archive records on the screen, and then at the closed chamber. And the people? Wu had no answer for that. That was enough to answer enough. The hybrid in the chamber made a small sound, almost a whine. It was the first time any of them had heard it express anything that sounded less than controlled. It remained still, but its body language had changed. The creature was frightened, not of them, of what was happening outside. Shuri read the next data string and went rigid. This is worse than you said. Claire looked at her. What now? Shuri turned the display toward them. The core feed is not only driving predator movement, it is also shutting down emergency barriers at selected intervals. T'Challa's eyes narrowed. To allow breaches. Yes? Claire stared. Why would anyone do that? Shuri answered with hard precision. Because a controlled crisis is more useful than a total one. If the public sees enough chaos, they can argue the island must be evacuated, stripped, and secured under private authority. Wu looked genuinely shaken now. I did not authorize that. No, Claire said bitterly. You just helped build the machinery that made it possible. He absorbed that in silence. T'Challa's attention moved to the corridor behind them. They were not alone in the district. He could hear it now, a distant impact somewhere down the line, followed by another, large movement, rapid, purposeful. The predators were still being driven. They were moving toward the human roots, and whatever was controlling the access feeds was continuing to do it. T'Challa turned to Claire. We need to stop the routing. She nodded immediately. Where? Shuri was already scrolling through the access map. The source node is deeper. Lower level. Restricted corridor off the old executive spine. Claire cursed under her breath. That area was locked down years ago. Not enough, Shuri said. Wu stepped forward. I can get you there. The room turned to him. Claire looked as if she might refuse on principle alone, but T'Challa stopped her with a glance. Whether they trusted Wu or not was less important than whether he could lead them to the one place where the control signal originated. And if he was lying, the island would reveal it soon enough. Wu seemed to understand this too. He held up his hand slightly, not in surrender, but in a strange kind of shame. I know the route, he said. I designed part of it. That earned him no sympathy. It did, however, earn him a place at the front. They moved out of the chamber quickly, leaving the hybrid sealed behind for the moment. Claire's expression suggested she hated every second of working with Wu, but the island had run out of time for clean choices. The corridor beyond the containment room branched into a narrow service passage descending toward the executive spine. Emergency lighting pulsed overhead. The walls were lined with conduits and old access labels partially obscured by moisture and dust. As they walked, T'Challa kept his pace measured and his senses open. The island had shifted again. There was more movement now in the lower district, more animal noise in the distance, and beneath it all, a faint electrical resonance from the core network. Someone was still pushing commands through the system. Not enough to take over fully, just enough to keep the island unstable. Claire walked beside Wu after a while, but she did not look at him. Why tell us now? She asked. Wu was quiet before answering. Because I think whoever is doing this wanted the island to break. That made her stop. He turned back, expression grim and tired. And because if they wanted it broken, then the system they're using may not stop at the island. There are external lines, off-site mirrors, backup feeds. If they succeed here, they may be able to pull data from the archive and move it before anyone can stop them. Shuri's expression sharpened. You mean export the whole program? Yes. T'Challa heard the full threat in that phrase. This was no longer a single-stranded island problem. This was a transfer, a seizure, a theft of living systems under the cover of disaster. He thought of kingdoms, of stewardship, of what happened when people mistook possession for responsibility. The island had not been created to serve life. It had been created to prove control over life, and now someone was trying to turn its collapse into profit. The shape of the injustice was older than the island, and larger than it too. At the end of the corridor, a sealed bulkhead blocked their path. Wu stepped forward, pressed his palm against a hidden panel, and the door opened with a hiss of old hydraulics. Beyond it lay the executive spine. It was a long, dark corridor lined with polished metal that had dulled with age. The overhead lights were mostly dead. Large glass windows on one side looked into a central operations trench full of cables, data lines, and dormant systems. On the other side, another sealed door led deeper into the island's hidden infrastructure. The whole space felt like the internal throat of a machine that had once thought itself immortal. And at the far end of the corridor, a red light blinked steadily above a console that had no business still functioning. The source node. Shuri stared at it. That's our target. Wu nodded, but his face had gone even paler. Be careful. Claire looked at him sharply. Why? He did not answer fast enough. T'Challa noticed the hesitation. Because there is something else here. Wu swallowed. Yes, he said. The control system is not empty. The corridor seemed to tighten around that sentence. What does that mean? Claire asked. Wu's voice was low now. It means somebody may already be inside the room. And from beyond the source node, through the sealed glass of the operations trench, a shape moved in the dark with the slow confidence of something that knew the island better than they did. The shape behind the glass did not move like a person rushing for cover. It moved with patience. That was what made it frightening. The corridor at the end of the executive spine was dead quiet, except for the faint hum coming from the source node and the occasional drip of condensation somewhere deep in the walls. The red indicator above the control panel blinked at a steady rhythm, like a pulse. Behind the glass trench, the shape shifted once more, and the group saw the outline of a shoulder, then a head, then the glint of reflected light off something held close to the body. Claire took a slow step forward. No, Shuri said immediately. Claire ignored her and moved closer to the glass. Her face tightened as the shape inside the operations trench came into view. It was a man, thin and hunched, dressed in a soaked park security jacket that looked several years too old for him. One sleeve hung torn. His hair was matted to his head. He was half crouched near a junction box, one hand on the wall, the other holding some kind of compact controller with a tangle of homemade wiring attached to it. Wu stopped dead beside them, his face drained of all color. "Who is that?" Claire asked. Wu did not answer at first. Then he whispered, "He shouldn't be alive." T'Challa's gaze sharpened. "You know him?" Wu swallowed. "Yes." Claire turned toward him, anger and disbelief colliding in her expression. "Then say his name." Wu looked as if he wished he could disappear into the floor. "Mr. Hoskins," he said. The name meant nothing to T'Challa, but it meant something to Claire. She recoiled slightly, not in fear, but in recognition of a kind she clearly wished she had never had to make. "The operations liaison," she said flatly. "He worked with the corporate logistics team." Shuri's eyes narrowed. "Worked?" Claire shook her head. "He was supposed to have left the island during the first evacuation cycle." Wu stared through the glass. "I saw his file, marked as extracted." "No," Claire said. "You saw the paperwork marked that way. That made the room colder." The man inside the trench looked up suddenly, as though he had felt the weight of being seen. His expression was sharp, alert, and the calm he wore was far more unsettling than panic would have been. There was no confusion in his face, no sign of a stranded employee trying to survive disaster. He looked like someone who had stayed behind on purpose. He raised the controller slightly. The red light on the source node shifted from steady blink to rapid pulse. Shuri immediately stepped to the nearest console. "He's using that unit to manipulate the routing." T'Challa moved to the glass and studied the trench below. A cable channel ran along the far wall. Maintenance access was visible at the far end. The man had clearly been there for some time. There were field tools laid out beside him, containers, cables, and a narrow access panel opened into the core network. He had not merely been hiding. He had embedded himself inside the island's systems like a parasite in a living host. Claire's voice was brittle. Hoskins was always pushing for expanded security protocols. Wu did not look at her. "He was not part of my team." "No," Claire said, with cold certainty. He was part of the corporate contingency. The man below smiled when he heard his name spoken. Then he spoke through the trench speaker in a voice that came across as smooth, almost amused. "Good to see some of us still remember how this place is supposed to work." Nobody answered. He looked at the group one by one. When his eyes passed over to T'Challa, they paused for a fraction of a second, assessing the suit, the posture, the calm. Then he looked at Claire and gave a small nod, as if they were old colleagues who had simply diverged on matters of policy. "You're late," he said. Claire stared at him in open disbelief. "What are you doing?" His smile widened slightly, keeping the island from being lost. Shuri let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "By turning the predators loose?" Hoskins tilted his head. "By proving they can't be contained by amateurs." Claire looked ready to cross the glass and strangle him with her bare hands. "You set the animals on the evacuation routes. I redirected them," he said. "There's a difference." T'Challa's tone was even. "Not one that matters to those being hunted." Hoskins met his gaze through the glass, and for the first time, his expression sharpened into something harder. "That's where we disagree," he said. "This island was built on the idea that life can be managed. It can't. It can be guided, it can be harvested, it can be leveraged. But people like you make the mistake of believing stewardship is the same thing as restraint." Claire's jaw tightened. "You call this stewardship?" He spread one hand slightly. "I call it realism. If the island falls into chaos, the external claimants will move in. They'll strip the archive, take the specimens, dissolve the site, and bury the evidence. What I'm doing is forcing a controlled failure before that happens." Shuri's face darkened. "You're making a disaster to justify a seizure. That's one way to put it." "No," T'Challa said. "It is the only way to put it." Hoskins smiled thinly, as if he appreciated the correction. "The board already authorized recovery operations," he said. "I'm simply making sure the right people recover the right things." Claire stepped toward the glass. "You mean yourself?" He looked at her with calculated calm. "I mean the people who understand what this island can become." She laughed once, sharply. "It became a prison the moment you decided animals were in inventory." His eyes narrowed a fraction. "And yet here we are, talking about value rather than morality. Funny how survival strips the lies away." T'Challa watched the exchange and felt the truth beneath it. Hoskins did not think of himself as a villain. That was the problem. He believed he was preserving something by destroying the trust needed to preserve it. Men like him always dressed theft in the language of necessity. Shuri had already started isolating the node, but the system was fighting back. "He's running multiple scripts," she said. "One is redirecting barrier flow. Another is overriding habitat paths. There's a third signal tied to the archive. He's trying to copy data out of the hidden core." Wu stiffened. "What data?" "Genetic records," Shuri said. "Behavioral models, access maps, probably every specimen sequence the island ever generated." Hoskins, hearing enough of the conversation through the trench speaker, gave a small, approving nod. "That's right," he said. "Because once the island is lost, someone should leave with the knowledge. The world will call it theft. The world always calls the future theft when it isn't theirs to control." Claire's anger finally broke through to her voice. "You're insane." He looked almost offended. "No, I'm practical. There's a private extraction team offshore already waiting for the first collapse window. I'm giving them a reason to act before the rival bidders do." The implications hit all of them at once. This was not simply an internal breach. It was a premeditated transfer, a way to force the island into enough chaos that corporate and black market interests could move in under the fiction of emergency salvage. T'Challa's expression did not change, but something in him hardened. "So the animals are bait," he said. Hoskins shrugged. "Assets are always bait when you don't own the market." One of the security staff muttered a curse under his breath. Shuri looked at Claire. Can I drop this man into the nearest ocean? Claire did not look away from Hoskins. Not yet. Hoskins saw that exchange and smiled again. You're wasting time. The routing is already in motion. As if to prove the point, the corridor lights overhead flickered red, then dimmed. Somewhere deeper in the island, an alarm began to sound. Not the high emergency tone they had heard earlier, but a lower, more ominous one-sector lock interference. The source node's screen flashed a new pattern, and the map on Shuri's device updated in real time. Predator routes were shifting again. Down below, the shape of another creature passed across the trench window. Larger this time. Scarred. The same sentinel they had seen before. It paused at the glass, head turning slowly, as if it had come to see what the human noise was about. Claire's face went still. It's here because of him, she said. Hoskins glanced upward, not remotely alarmed. It's here because the network is working. No, T'Challa said quietly. It is here because it senses the threat. Hoskins gave him a look of thin amusement. You speak as though the island has chosen sides. It has, T'Challa replied. For the first time, Hoskins' expression soured. Then it made a poor choice. The scarred predator below the trench let out a low sound, almost a warning. The smaller shapes in the shadows answered it. The routing system, disturbed by Hoskins' scripts, had begun to feed movement back through the corridors. That meant the pack was circling closer. Shuri's head jerked up. We have a bigger problem. He's forcing the system to open the inner barriers. Claire stared. Why would he do that? Because, Shuri said, fury rising in her voice. He wants the animals and the people in the same place long enough for the extract team to arrive and secure everything. Hoskins spread both hands as though the answer should have been obvious. You see, he said, practical. T'Challa stepped toward the console. We will stop the routing. Hoskins laughed quietly. You can try. Claire looked at Wu. Tell me you knew about this. Wu did not answer immediately, and that silence was enough to wound her all over again. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I suspected there were people waiting for a breach. That is not the same as telling us. No, he said, it isn't. The gap between guilt and complicity is where entire systems die. Shuri finally found a weakness in the source node feed and started rerouting the island's habitat controls away from Hoskins' scripts. If I can get into the secondary feed, she muttered, I can break the pattern long enough to isolate the executive line. How long? T'Challa asked. Minutes, she said, maybe less. Then do it. She did not hesitate. While Shuri worked, Claire turned to T'Challa. I need to get to the lower access junction. If I can manually close the southern path, we can stop the larger creatures from being driven toward the visitor sector. T'Challa nodded once. Take 2 of the security staff. The Dora Milaje will escort you. And you? He looked through the glass trench at Hoskins. I will deal with the man who believes this island belongs to those who can seize it. Claire held his gaze for a beat. There was something like agreement in it, and something like gratitude. But mostly, there was the shared understanding of people who had reached the point where polite language no longer described the situation. She nodded and moved to organize the team. Wu lingered beside the console, visibly torn between fear and a need to atone for something he had helped create. If Hoskins gets the archive copy, he said, the specimens will be taken apart in labs all over the world. Shuri did not look up. Then perhaps you should have stopped him earlier. Wu accepted that without protest. It was the only wise thing he had done so far. The red alarm tone deepened. Another predator call echoed from farther down the corridor. Then another. Hoskins heard it and smiled in the trench below, as if the island itself had confirmed his thesis. Too late, he said. Your park is already collapsing. T'Challa placed both hands on the rail and looked down at him. No, he said. Your control is collapsing. Hoskins' smile faltered for the first time. And in the trench behind him, the shadow of the larger predator moved closer to the glass, not as prey, not as asset, but as something that had finally decided who on the island was most dangerous. Hoskins did not flinch when the predator pressed close to the trench glass. That was what made him dangerous. Not courage exactly, but the conviction that everything around him still belonged to a system he understood. The red lights pulsed across his face in sharp intervals, turning him into a kind of specter inside the operations trench. He looked at T'Challa through the glass and smiled, as if the situation had only narrowed to the point where better minds would now take control. "They're yours, if you can hold them," he said. T'Challa's answer came quietly. "They were never yours." Hoskins' smile faded by a fraction. The scarred predator below the trench shifted again, claws clicking softly against the metal flooring. It was not lunging, it was waiting. Behind it, the shadows moved with the faint, disordered motion of smaller bodies. The pack had gathered, not in panic, in alignment. Shuri's fingers flew over the console behind T'Challa. "I have the secondary feed," she said, not looking up. "Give me 30 seconds and I can collapse the executive routing." Hoskins laughed once, short and bitter. "You think that ends it?" "It ends you," she replied. Claire was already moving down the side corridor with 2 security staff and one of the Dora Milaje, heading toward the lower access junction. Their footsteps faded quickly into the deeper district, swallowed by the architecture of the island. T'Challa did not watch them go for long. His attention remained on Hoskins, on the trench, on the growing awareness that the predator below was not merely responding to the human threat, it was reading it. This island was no longer only about broken systems and stolen genetics. It had become a place where the consequences of human arrogance had learned to recognize their makers. Hoskins reached for the controller in his hand and thumbed another command into it. The source node light flashed. Somewhere deep in the island, a barrier door slammed shut with a boom that rolled through the corridor like thunder. Shuri swore. He still got manual override on the northern route. Hoskins looked at her without concern. Not for long. T'Challa moved. Not to attack, to observe. He stepped away from the rail and studied the trench's lower line. There was a maintenance access panel at the far end, partly hidden behind a line of dead conduit housing. If the creature below was willing to stay where it was, then it was likely driven here by the routing net, not by random hunger. That meant Hoskins' system had already made itself visible to the island's larger predators. They could sense the pressure of the control signal. They could sense that a human had tried to make them move as if they were pieces on a board. The predator below lifted its head and let out a low, resonant sound. Not a roar, a call. The smaller shapes in the trench answered. And then, with a violence that cracked the rhythm of the entire corridor, the far maintenance hatch blew inward as another raptor pack burst through the service access line. One security staffer fired instinctively. The shot ricocheted off the trench wall, drawing a shriek of metal from the support beams. The raptors did not charge straight in. They split at the corners, moving with the same eerie coordination T'Challa had seen before. They were not there by accident. Hoskins' routing had pulled them in. Claire's voice crackled over the comm from deeper in the district. "T'Challa, we've got a line break at the lower junction. There's too much pressure in the path. It's feeding the creatures toward the promenade." T'Challa answered while keeping his body between the raptors and the console. "Then close it manually. We're trying." A crash echoed in the background, followed by another. The island was tightening around them. One of the raptors leapt for the console rail. T'Challa intercepted it mid-air, the impact driving both of them sideways into the wall. The vibranium suit took the force cleanly, but the beast was agile, twisting hard to reach his throat. T'Challa hooked one arm under its body, spun, and slammed it into the floor before it could get its teeth in. The creature recovered at once and sprang away, hissing. Shuri did not stop typing. "That one was reckless," she said. "They are being driven," T'Challa replied. By the island? By a man who thinks the island can be driven. Hoskins looked almost pleased. There, you see it. Even your animals are responding to structure. T'Challa turned to him. You are not controlling them. You are agitating them. Hoskins shrugged. If a herd moves, does it matter whether it was pushed or persuaded? It matters to the people it crushes, not to the market. That was the moment T'Challa understood the full shape of Hoskins' logic. He did not care whether the island survived as a sanctuary, a reserve, or a graveyard. He cared about what could be extracted from the wreckage before outside claimants arrived. The animals were leverage. The hidden archive was leverage. The panic was leverage. Everything was leverage, because to men like him, the world only became real when it had been priced. The source node alarm shifted pitch again. Shuri looked up, alarmed. He's trying to trigger the archive transfer now. T'Challa moved back to the rail and scanned the lower trench. Can you stop it? I can slow it. But the data mirror is external. Wu, who had been frozen near the doorway with the haunted look of a man watching his work become someone else's weapon, suddenly spoke. There's a hardline junction in the executive vault, he said. Claire's voice came over the comm at once. You said the vault was sealed. It is, he replied. It was. T'Challa narrowed his eyes. What changed? Wu hesitated. Hoskins has access to the override map. He can route through the vault if the environmental seals are weak enough. Shuri turned around sharply. Why do you know that? Wu swallowed. Because I helped design the redundancies. Nobody was surprised. The island had reached the point where everyone in it had some relationship to the thing collapsing around them. Claire knew the park. Wu knew the science. Hoskins knew the theft. T'Challa and Shuri were the outsiders forced to decide whether to preserve the place or tear out the system that made its abuse possible. The answer, as always, was not simple. A sudden crack of static flared over the comm. Claire's voice returned, strained. We've hit the lower access gate. The pathway's jammed. Ah! The sound of something huge thudded through the background. Then Claire again. There are creatures in the corridor. T'Challa's attention sharpened immediately. How many? I can't tell. Another impact. Another shout. Then a roar that shook the audio line hard enough to distort it. The scarred predator below the trench turned its head toward the corridor beyond the source node. It had heard it too. It knew the pack was shifting. It knew the humans were split. It knew, in the animal way that mattered here, that the island was changing shape around the human struggle. Hoskins took the opportunity to activate another routing command. The source node flare brightened. Shuri slammed a hand onto the console. He just opened the archive mirror. Can you shut it down? Not while he's physically connected. T'Challa looked at the corridor beyond the trench. He could reach the node through the side catwalk, but that would put him in open range to whatever Hoskins had routed through the access lines. The choice existed only because no one in the room had the luxury of clean outcomes anymore. He stepped toward the side rail. Shuri glanced at him. Brother, I should probably tell you I dislike when you do this. That is consistent. She shook her head and shoved a data spike into the terminal. Fine. Give me 10 seconds and I can jam his feed. Hoskins saw what she was doing and finally lost some of his composure. You touch that terminal, and you'll collapse the barrier net. Shuri looked at him with cold satisfaction. Good, he frowned. You'll kill the routing. Yes, you'll release the animals. No, she corrected. I'll release the island from your hands. Hoskins' jaw tightened. That was enough. T'Challa moved. He vaulted the side rail, crossed the narrow catwalk in 3 long strides, and dropped into the upper access recess directly above the source node. Below, Hoskins spun in place, suddenly aware that he was no longer the only person controlling the board. T'Challa reached the panel housing, ripped it open, and exposed the manual spine of the system. A burst of sparks flared. The node pulsed red, then white, then red again. Hoskins shouted something incomprehensible. The scarred predator below the trench surged toward the glass. Then the pack moved all at once. Not at the humans. At the corridor wall behind Hoskins' trench compartment. The first raptor struck the support seam. The second hit the maintenance hatch. A third, smaller and faster, lunged at the conduit cluster beneath the glass. The reinforced corridor shook as the animals reacted not to command, but to threat. The routing noise from Hoskins' controller had finally crossed the line from signal to injury. The island had read it as violence and answered in kind. The glass trench cracked with a long, ugly line. Hoskins staggered back. For the first time, his face showed something real: fear. T'Challa drove his hand into the manual spine and severed the live feed. The source node died with a sudden flash. Every red indicator in the corridor blinked once and then cut to black. For half a second, there was silence. Then every creature in the immediate district answered, not with panic, with release. The predators in the trench bolted deeper into the maintenance network. The scarred sentinel leaped the rail of the lower trench and vanished into the corridor below with stunning speed. The raptors vanished after it, no longer held by routing pressure, their movement suddenly their own again. Hoskins lunged for the dead console. No! Shuri's voice cut through the air behind T'Challa. He's lost the mirror feed. That should have been enough. It wasn't. Because somewhere deeper in the island, a second alarm began to sound. Not from the source node, from the outer containment sectors. Claire's voice burst over the comm at the same moment. T'Challa, we've got a breach at the southern route. 2 large predators just crossed into the promenade. Shuri's eyes widened. That wasn't from Hoskins. Wu stared at the darkened screen as if seeing the full scale of the disaster all at once. There must be another control path. Hoskins, now fully aware that his window was closing, tried to wrench the controller back online. T'Challa caught his wrist before he could strike the casing. You are finished, T'Challa said. Hoskins glared at him. You don't understand what happens next. I understand exactly. No, Hoskins said, voice cracking with fury. The island will be declared unsafe. They'll bring in response contractors. They'll take everything they can carry. The reserve will be erased. 1. End quote. Claire came over the comm again, breathless and furious. Then we stopped them. Hoskins looked from face to face and realized no one was bargaining anymore. Not Claire, not Shuri, not T'Challa, not even Wu. That was the moment he chose desperation. He slammed the controller into a hidden port beneath the console, trying to force one last data transfer. Sparks erupted. The trench lights strobed. The node began to scream in electronic distortion as the archive mirror attempted to complete a partial extraction despite the damaged routing. Shuri swore. He's forcing the local backup. T'Challa twisted Hoskins away from the panel, but the controller had already done its work. Somewhere in the island, external access doors began to cycle open in sequence. Not all of them. Just enough to destabilize the remaining barriers. Enough to create movement. Enough to produce the crisis Hoskins had wanted. Outside, the whole island groaned. The answer was immediate. The dinosaur calls rose through the district. The creatures had been denied, redirected, cornered, and now the hidden system had failed them open. Claire's voice came through the comm, hard and sharp. We've got a full motion surge. They're coming through the eastern corridor. T'Challa locked eyes with Hoskins. That is your doing, he said. Hoskins bared his teeth in something that was not quite a smile. That is survival. Then Shuri hit the override. The console blew with a brilliant spray of sparks. The remaining routing lines went dark. The sound of the archive transfer severing echoed across the source node like a body finally giving up the last of its strength. Hoskins stumbled backward, one hand over his face. The island, suddenly freed from the artificial pressure that had driven so much of the chaos, did not become peaceful. It became honest. The predators were still loose. The breaches were real. The human routes were still vulnerable. But the island no longer answered to a thief's hand. It answered to itself. T'Challa stepped away from the ruined node and looked into the lower trench where the scarred sentinel had vanished. The island had survived being used. Now it had to survive being left alone with the truth. And somewhere ahead, beyond the dead console and the broken glass, and the man who had tried to turn collapse into profit, Claire was already facing the next wave. The source node died, but the island did not become safe. It became real. That was the difference T'Challa understood as soon as the alarm spread outward through the district. The hidden control system had been forcing the island into a false pattern, bending predator movement, opening and closing barriers, creating pressure where no creature or survivor could breathe normally. Once that pressure vanished, everything the island had been hiding rushed back at once. The sound came first. A distant boom through the southern corridor, then another. Then the unmistakable roar of large animals driven into human territory by panic, hunger, and open roots. Somewhere below, Claire was shouting orders. Somewhere above, the overhead lights began to flicker in stuttering red and white as the island's backup systems fought to decide whether they were still in charge. Hoskins had gone pale. He looked at the dead console as if it had betrayed him personally. "No," he whispered. "No, no." T'Challa grabbed him by the front of the jacket and slammed him back against the wall, hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. "This is what you built." Hoskins tried to recover his composure, but the edge had gone out of him. "You don't understand what they'll do when this is exposed. I understand enough. They'll erase the island. Then they should never have tried to own it." Hoskins' eyes darted to the corridor exit, to the dead node, to the trench where the scarred predator had vanished. He was calculating escape routes the way frightened men always did when the illusion of control breaks. But the island had moved beyond him now. His systems were dead. His leverage was gone. All that remained was the disaster he had chosen to create. Claire's voice cracked over the comm. "T'Challa, we've got a serious breach in the promenade. 2 large predators, maybe 3, and the evac route is failing." Shuri answered from somewhere deeper in the hall, voice tight and fast. "I'm trying to restore the barrier network, but the executive spine is gone. He destroyed the routing map." Wu, still standing near the broken console with a haunted look that had become his permanent expression, finally spoke. "There's one thing left," he said. Claire's voice snapped back at him. "If you say one more thing that sounds like a hidden backup, I'm throwing you into the ocean myself." Wu flinched, but kept going. "The habitat doors." T'Challa turned toward him. "Explain." Wu swallowed hard. "There's a manual cascade for the northern enclosure grid. It was designed to open the safe valleys and redirect the largest creatures out of the public corridors if full collapse happened." Shuri stared. "You are telling us this now? I didn't think it would be needed." Claire barked a cold laugh. "You helped build a park for creatures you never thought would escape, and you never believed collapse was possible?" Wu looked away. "That," she said, "is not helping your case." T'Challa understood the shape of the choice before anyone else fully named it. If the manual cascade could still be activated, the island might be able to open internal habitat routes, giving the creatures space to move away from the human routes. It would not stop every predator. It would not undo the breaches, but it might reduce the immediate slaughter and keep the worst of the animals from being driven into the surviving staff. It was not salvation. It was triage. He looked at Shuri. "Can you access it?" She was already scrolling through the deadened console mirrors. "If the map is still physically intact, yes, but the control junction is at the lower ridge station." Claire heard that and immediately said, "That's on the other side of the promenade." "Exactly," Shuri replied. Another crash rolled through the structure. The ceiling lights blinked out for a second, then relit weakly. Somewhere outside, the sound of heavy footsteps thundered through the corridor network. The island was shifting under pressure, and everyone in the room could feel it. The raptors had been released from the routing net. The larger predators were now moving on instinct and memory. The human survivors were too close to the roots. That meant time had become the island's most expensive currency. T'Challa made the decision immediately. We split. Claire looked at him sharply. No. Yes. She took one step toward him. That's a bad plan. He met her gaze. It is the only one we have. He pointed to the corridor behind them. You go back to the lower junction with Shuri and Wu. Open the habitat cascade. Free the northern valleys. Give the creatures a route away from the promenade. Claire's expression hardened. And you? Quote. He looked toward the southern access line, where the breach alarms were now rising and falling in waves. I will help the survivors get clear. Hoskins laughed abruptly, the sound thin and ugly. You think you can save them all? T'Challa didn't even turn toward him. No, I think I can save enough. That answer silenced everyone, even Hoskins. The truth of it was harsh, but honest. Not every life could be brought through a collapsing system. Not every route could be reopened. Not every mistake could be undone before consequence arrived. The question was always the same on a battlefield, on a failing island, or in a kingdom under attack. What can be defended if one is willing to choose quickly enough? Claire looked at him for a long beat, then nodded once. Fine, she said. But if you die doing this, I'm not forgiving you. He almost smiled. Noted. Shuri was already moving, gathering the portable diagnostics and the emergency override kit. Wu followed her with the dazed obedience of a man who had lost the right to lead, but not yet the courage to try to help. The Dora Milaje split their attention. One stayed with T'Challa, the other moved with Claire. The security staff were regrouping around the injured and the nearest exits. Hoskins, now clearly aware that none of them cared about his opinion anymore, backed slowly toward the broken service access. T'Challa noticed immediately. You are not leaving, he said. Hoskins gave him a strange smile. I'm not staying either. Before anyone could stop him, he triggered a small emergency latch on the wall panel and disappeared into a maintenance crawl space behind the executive spine. The hatch slammed shut behind him. Shuri looked over her shoulder, disgusted. Coward. No, T'Challa said, eyes narrowing. Not yet. Claire was already moving toward the lower ridge route, but before she went, she looked back at the now dark source node. If he gets out of the island, he'll hand this to the highest bidder. T'Challa nodded. Then we must make sure he does not. She gave a grim, exhausted smile, one of those smiles that appears only when a person has accepted the shape of the storm and decided to walk into it anyway. Try to keep the animals from eating the people, she said. I will do what I can. Not enough, she shot back. The words were blunt, but not cruel. She understood him well enough now to know that his answer was the kind of answer a king gives when there are no clean victories left. Then Claire left with Shuri and Wu toward the lower junction, their footsteps fading into the red-lit corridor. The rescue group tightened around the remaining wounded. The surviving staff were in various states of shock, but they were moving. That meant the island still had a chance to avoid the worst possible end. T'Challa turned with the Dora Milaje and headed for the promenade breach. The corridor, out of the executive spine, opened into a broad service walkway above the central district. From there, the full scope of the collapse became visible. The park had become a battlefield. Emergency lights flashed against rain-slick stone. Broken signboards hung from bent poles. Trees had burst through retaining walls. Vehicles sat abandoned in the open, doors hanging. Farther ahead, a pair of predators crashed through the old retail district, chased by the sound of human shouts and failing alarms. One of the larger creatures had already reached the promenade edge. Another moved through the fountain plaza. The island was no longer reacting to a hidden command. It was reacting to the release of all the tension that had been built into it from the beginning. And in that chaos, the people still alive needed a path. T'Challa moved fast. A technician stumbled into the open, nearly trampled by the turning bulk of a panicked herbivore that had been driven from the north path. T'Challa caught the person by the shoulder and pulled him out of the way just before the animal crashed through the sidewall into the open courtyard. The impact shattered glass. Screams echoed from somewhere nearby. A child, perhaps, or a younger staff member. The sound was lost in the roar of another beast breaking through the tree line. The Dora Milaje split the flow of panicked staff and guided them toward the service gates. T'Challa looked across the promenade and saw Claire and Shuri at the lower access point in the distance, dwarfed by the scale of the old park structures. They had reached the manual junction. Wu was with them, apparently helping under the watchful eye of both irritation and necessity. Shuri was feeding power into the old habitat network. Claire was at the lock panel. The junction itself sat beneath a reinforced tower that led toward the northern enclosure system. If they succeeded, the island's upper valleys would open. If they failed, the predators would continue pouring into the public district. A roar boomed from the left. T'Challa turned just in time to see the scarred sentinel from the trench emerge from the service alley, followed by two raptors and a much larger shape behind them. The sentinel paused on the edge of the walkway, not attacking, but reading the field. It had not come for him. It had come because the island had lost its shape, and the animal had become what it had always needed to be, a creature with territory to defend. For one charged moment, man and beast simply looked at each other. Then the sentinel veered away and charged past the promenade toward the side valley, where Claire and Shuri were working the habitat doors. T'Challa immediately understood. It was moving toward the opening routes. It was trying to reach the same place they were trying to save. "Go," he said to Dora Milaje. "Protect the junction." They ran. He headed the other direction, toward the survivors clustered near the promenade. A security vehicle had flipped onto its side, trapping two staff members under the wreckage. Nearby, one of the old electrified fences had restarted in a broken pulse, sparking against wet ground. The area was chaotic, but controlled chaos still needed a center, and T'Challa became it. He pulled one trapped worker free, then shoved the second behind the overturned vehicle just as a raptor burst through the undergrowth. The beast lunged. T'Challa intercepted it with a hard strike that drove it back into a low wall. The impact cracked old stone. The raptor recovered, screeching, and a second one came in from the flank. This was no longer a duel. It was a defense. He fought to keep the living moving. At the same time, Claire's voice crackled over the comm from the junction. "We've got the northern doors half open." Shuri says, "The cascade is responding." Then Shuri, strained but steady, "Tell T'Challa the habitat routes are coming online, but if the main promenade isn't clear in 90 seconds, the creatures will split through both corridors." Claire shouted something to Wu in the background, then came back on the line. "We need him now." T'Challa heard the urgency and moved faster. He signaled the surviving security teams to shift toward the side path. The Dora Milaje cut off one of the raptors and drove it away from the evac route. Another creature, larger and heavier, barreled through the breached hedge wall toward the main square. The old park had become a maze of escape routes and dead ends, and every second changed which side of the maze belonged to the living. Then came the sound that changed everything. A low mechanical rumble from beneath the promenade. The habitat cascade had activated. One by one, far across the island, the hidden valley gates began to open. Internal routes that had once been sealed for display purposes unlocked in sequence, spreading a new pattern through the island's terrain. The effect was immediate. The predators, no longer pressed by artificial routing and now sensing open territory in the safer valleys, began to shift away from the human corridors. Not all of them, not neatly, but enough. The sentinel in the distance turned and vanished into the newly opened northern channel. The larger beasts followed. The flow changed. Claire's voice returned, breathless but fierce. "It's working." Shuri sounded exhausted enough to collapse, but there was triumph underneath the strain. "Told you, the architecture was salvageable." Wu, unbelievably, spoke too. "The old safety logic is functioning." Claire answered him with brutal sincerity. "Don't talk to me until the island stops trying to eat us." T'Challa almost smiled, despite everything. The worst of the immediate flow had shifted away from the promenade, but the island was still unstable, and Hoskins was still loose somewhere in the maintenance spine. That meant the crisis was not over. It had simply changed shape. T'Challa gathered the remaining evac survivors and forced them toward the now clear side access. The engineers and security staff moved with him, some limping, some crying, all of them alive. The path through the promenade opened into a broad service lane, lined with shattered display structures and damaged transit carts. Above them, the rain had finally begun to fall again, washing the dust and blood from the park's broken face. Claire reached him by the side entrance, just as the last of the upper route gates swung fully open. Her expression was grim, but there was relief in it too. "We've got the North Valleys," she said. "The animals have somewhere to go." T'Challa nodded. "And the people?" She looked around at the surviving staff and then back at him. "Some of them do too." It was not enough for a perfect ending. It was not even enough to call the island healed, but it was enough to call it better than it had been. Then the ground beneath them trembled again, this time deeper, harder. T'Challa looked up and saw a plume of smoke rising from the old executive district. Claire saw it too. What now? He already knew. Hoskins had done one final thing. Somewhere in the hidden core or the maintenance spine, he had triggered a fail surge. Not enough to kill the island, enough to make it look like the island had done it to itself. The kind of damage that would justify outside intervention, recovery teams, and the stripping of every hidden archive. Shuri's voice came over the comm, sharp with realization. He's trying to erase the evidence on his way out. T'Challa's expression hardened. Then the island made its answer known. From deep in the reserve, where the northern valleys had just opened, the predators had begun moving away from the people and toward the sea line, the great ones, the scarred ones. The animals that had been treated as commodities, experiments, and weapons were now moving in a pattern that was not human but was unmistakably purposeful. They were reclaiming their kingdom. And the island, once used as a cage, was becoming a place where the living would decide their own paths. T'Challa looked across the rising smoke, at Claire, at Shuri in the distance, at the remaining survivors grouped beneath the broken lights, and at the enormous green span of the reserve beyond the park's dead perimeter. This was the choice, not between victory and defeat, between ownership and stewardship, between exploitation and refuge. He made it. The people would live. The island would remain, and whatever came next would have to reckon with the fact that it no longer belonged to those who thought they could buy life. It belonged to life itself. By the time the smoke cleared, the island no longer felt like a park at all. It felt like a wounded territory learning how to breathe again. The northern valleys had opened just enough to pull the largest predators away from the central promenade. The surviving animals moved through the reactivated habitat routes in waves of muscle, scale, and instinct, no longer pushed by Hoskins' routing scripts or trapped by the island's old containment logic. The people still alive clustered in the service corridors, watching the jungle beyond the broken fences with a mixture of terror and relief that came too late to be pure either way. Claire stood on the upper walkway overlooking the reserve boundary, rain sliding down the side of her face, and watched the last of the evacuation teams move toward higher ground. The old park lights were failing one by one behind her. The giant displays, the branded signs, the visitor paths, the polished fantasy of control, all of it was gone or dying. T'Challa came to stand beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Below them, the scarred sentinel disappeared into the green, followed by its pack. The larger beasts had chosen the widened valley route over the human corridors. Smaller predators followed. Herbivores crossed in the distance, moving in unsteady but real patterns. It was messy, dangerous, and alive. Claire finally exhaled. I thought I was trying to save a business. T'Challa looked out over the reserve. You were trying to save life inside one. She almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. That sounds noble when you say it. It was never noble, he said. Only necessary. Behind them, Shuri emerged from the lower junction, with Wu trailing several paces back. Both were exhausted. Shuri looked like she had spent the last hour wrestling with a machine that resented being told no. Wu looked like a man who had just discovered that knowledge can survive while trust does not. It's stable, Shuri said. For now. Claire turned to her. How long? Shuri shrugged with very Wakandan disdain for vague disasters. Long enough to keep the island from eating itself tonight. Beyond that, the architecture will need permanent refactoring. Wu looked at the reserve with a mix of awe and dread. If the external mirror was completed before shutdown, the archive may already be partially exposed. Claire's jaw tightened. Can they still get in? Maybe, Wu said, but not easily. The cascade broke the routing map. Shuri folded her arms. Which means anyone trying to raid the site now would have to do it the hard way. T'Challa glanced toward the sea, where the incoming sky had darkened again. The storm had returned, but it no longer felt like the island was being punished. It felt like the place was simply continuing to be itself. What happens to the reserve now? Claire asked quietly. It was the question at the center of everything. T'Challa looked at her before he answered. That depends on who you let define it. She studied him, then looked back across the land. I'm not letting anyone turn it into a business again. That is a beginning. She nodded once, slowly. Then, I'll stay. The decision landed in the air with a kind of quiet gravity. It was not triumphant. It was not dramatic. It was simply right. Shuri raised one eyebrow. You're willingly taking responsibility for an island full of dinosaurs? Claire gave her a flat look. I'd rather manage dinosaurs than investors. That got the first real smile of the night from Shuri. The survivors were evacuated by dawn. International observers would arrive later, along with the lawyers, the investigators, the opportunists, and the people who would try to rename the whole disaster into something less embarrassing for their financial backers. But by then, the truth of the island would already be changed. The living archive, as Shuri suggested calling it, was no longer a park, a brand, or a hidden laboratory. It was a sanctuary built from the ruins of exploitation and defended by the people who had finally chosen what the island should be. Not owned, cared for. That was the difference T'Challa knew would matter. Later, after the last emergency craft had lifted away and the sea had gone quiet again, he returned with Claire and Shuri to the lower core chamber where the hidden archive still stood. The containment pod was sealed. The hybrid in the chamber remained alive, frightened, and under observation, not as a trophy or weapon, but as a living thing that had been denied the chance to exist without purpose. Shuri brought up the final file from the archive mirror and read the metadata in silence. Claire asked, "What does it say?" Shuri's voice softened just a fraction. That the island wasn't only built to create dinosaurs. It was built to preserve things the original scientists thought might be lost if their work was ever turned toward profit. T'Challa looked at the sealed chamber. So, they left behind a rescue path. Yes, Shuri said, and a warning. Claire folded her arms. What warning? Shuri turned the display toward them. The file contained one last line from the old custodian's logs, handwritten in the digital margin before the system was buried. Life cannot be managed forever. It must be protected, or it will be taken. No one said anything for several seconds. Then Claire let out a slow breath and looked toward the chamber. That's what this place was always supposed to be. T'Challa nodded. And what it became depended on who held it. The storm rolled in again over the trees, but the reserve no longer seemed threatened by it. It seemed to welcome it, as wild things do. The island was still dangerous, It would always be dangerous. But danger was not the same as evil, and survival was not the same as conquest. The error had been human arrogance. The correction was stewardship. He left Claire with the first of the new conservation teams and returned to the ridge alone before sunrise. From there, the whole island stretched beneath him in layers of shadow and green and rainlight. He could see the old roads cutting through the forest like scars. He could see the reopened valleys where the animals now moved. He could see the dark line of the ocean at the edge of the world. The island was no longer a monument to what humanity could own. It was a reminder of what humanity had no right to possess. Claire found him there a little later, still looking out over the reserve. "You're leaving soon," she said. He did not turn. "Yes. You came here, wrecked out of the sky, fought dinosaurs, exposed a conspiracy, and somehow made me responsible for a sanctuary full of giant reptiles." "That sounds accurate." She gave a tired laugh. "You make it sound normal. For Wakanda, it is not unusual." She looked at him for a long moment, then asked the question that had been sitting between them since the first day. "Do you think it can really survive?" T'Challa considered the island, the reserve, the restored roots, the frightened hybrid in the chamber, the surviving staff, the reworked systems, and the creatures reclaiming their space in the morning mist. "Yes," he said. "If the people who remain remember that the island belongs to the living, not to the people who profit from it." Claire nodded, accepting the answer because it was true, not because it was comforting. Then she looked out at the jungle and said, "I'm going to need better security." He almost smiled. "I imagine you will. And less corporate paperwork. You may need to fight harder for that." "I will." He turned at last and looked at her. There was no victory speech left to make, no dramatic closure, only the quiet beginning of responsibility, which was harder and better than conquest. The first light of day spilled across the reserve, catching on wet leaves, broken concrete, and the backs of creatures moving through the trees, without fear of a human hand reaching for them. That was the ending of the island's first war. Not with a corpse on the ground, with a choice. And because the choice had been made correctly, the kingdom did not belong to the bored, the bidders, or the hunters. It belonged to the living. Indeed, more stories await.